a lot of the problems that we tend to have are associated with the fact that our cropping systems outside of wheat are somewhat new. So we grow canola, which is relatively speaking a new plant, a new crop, right? And then, like I mentioned, we grow a lot of these pulses. And so we seem to be trapped between the fact that they're new, which is problematic, the fact that there seems to have been some newly sort of introduced or sort of arriving pests, and then unfortunately probably climate change. And so we seem to be just getting new pests in a lot of cases, and things that were historically minor pests, if anything, are starting to become increasingly important.
Welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show by Wisenetics. I'm your host, Leo Bastos, Assistant Professor in Integrative Precision Ag at the University of Georgia. Today, we welcome our guest, Dr. Sean Prager. He's an Associate Professor in the Department of Plant Sciences at the University of Saskatchewan. Sean, welcome to the Crop Science Podcast Show. It's great to have you here with us today. And to get things started, I want to ask if you could share with us how you got to where you are today.
Well, I got here directly from California. So the start is that so I'm originally American, even though I'm at a Canadian university. I have an undergraduate degree in biology with a focus on ecology. So as an undergraduate, I sort of worked in my first labs working on insects. So I've sort of been an entomologist from the start. I then took some time off for about a year to work in a research lab at the University of Maryland, studying more insects mostly. Most of those were sort of very ecological and evolution topics. Then I moved to Ontario, so I did grad school in Canada, where I got my PhD, working on bees. And then I moved from big sort of Hymenopteran to small Hymenoptera. So I then went and did a postdoc at the USDA in Delaware at the Beneficial Insects Introduction Lab. And I studied parasitoids that the hope was to use as biological control agents for aphid, for soybean aphid. So I followed the sort of sucking insects to Texas, where I started working on zebra chip disease. So I was there for about a year at Texas A&M as a postdoc. Then moved to California, a research scientist at the University of California, Riverside. And I was there for about 5 years working on various things. Largely zebra chip, in addition to other things, on mostly row crops and big field production of horticultural crops, tomatoes, potatoes. And then I got recruited or hired to my current position at the University of Saskatchewan.
Perfect. And can you tell us a little bit about what types of projects or research areas you've been working with recently?
I am, ironically, the first entomologist the College of Agriculture has ever had here at the university. This is a bit of a thing that I like to point out because it's a little strange, because our province has 40 million, roughly, acres of seeded cropland that had never had an agricultural entomologist until I got here. So that 40 million acres can be brought up into, can sort of split up. So a huge portion of it would be wheat. That's the traditional sort of crop up here. An equal amount roughly is in canola. And then we produce a lot of other pulse crops. So that's another really important portion of our agriculture. And increasingly, I actually work on the pulses. They seem to be more problematic in certain ways, perhaps probably because they're newer. And they're a little unusual to grow in North America, at least the pulse crops that we grow, right? So non-soybean and non-dry bean. Which we do a lot of. And so with that in mind, I kind of do most of the entomology at the university level in the field crops that are up here, plus bits and pieces of other things. And then a lot of my training and my experiences in vector biology, starting way back as an undergrad working on mosquitoes, and then zebra chip disease and citrus greenie in California. And so we also do a lot of work in sort of virology and sort of the non-fungal pathogens that infect the crops up here.
So this is really great, because I was actually very curious to hear, what were the main crops and cropping systems in this part of the world you live in. So thanks for sharing that already. And so I guess to follow that up, what are some of the most challenging insects that growers have to manage in your area?
The historic problematic insect in our area would be grasshoppers, just like you imagine it would be. But in some ways, they're the least problematic because at least we know what they are and we've had them forever. A lot of the problems that we tend to have are associated with the fact that our cropping systems outside of wheat are somewhat new. So we grow canola, which is relatively speaking a new plant, a new crop, right? And then, like I mentioned, we grow a lot of these pulses. And so we seem to be trapped between the fact that they're new, which is problematic, the fact that there seems to have been some newly sort of introduced or sort of arriving pests, and then unfortunately probably climate change. And so we seem to be just getting new pests in a lot of cases, and things that were historically minor pests, if anything, are starting to become increasingly important. And so that kind of spreads across. So you could sort of take it, I guess you could take it crop by crop. Like I said, so in wheat, we have sort of more traditional problems. They tend to be grasshoppers. Some parts of the province and neighboring provinces have wheat stem sawfly, although it's not as big a problem for us yet. We have orange blossom wheat midge, which of course is a problem in wheat production pretty much everywhere. But we do have resistant wheat, and so that's not as much of a problem for us. And then in the last couple of years, especially the last year or so, we've started to see sort of an emergence of Hessian fly, which is a problem because the wheat varieties that are grown in Saskatchewan typically are not resistant to the Hessian fly, or at least we're not bred to have that resistance. So unlike parts of the Midwest and Kansas and sort of the wheat parts of the United States, we don't have varieties that have that resistance in it.
Perfect. And I think you're really talking about something very key here as far as perhaps bringing different tools to manage pests here. So we're talking about crops being resistant to some of these pests. Can you tell us a little bit about just that integrative pest management aspect in your work, and what are some of the main tools that are working well for that region?
Yeah, so we tend to think of it. We definitely think of IPM, and I, at least in my research program, we tend to think of it as try to think of it as a sort of short, medium, and long term kind of way of going about things. So short term, I would say, is the very traditional IPM tools, and we do a lot of work to try to generate those, and that's things like economic thresholds and economic injury levels and sampling plans, the tools that allow you to manage it from the manage pests in the sort of the simplest way, which of course is still insecticide application, the least desirable, but the one that needs to be done. So there's that. From there, then you move on to trying to do beneficial insect work. We don't do a lot of releases, obviously, for field crops here, but we do try to think of different ways that we can supplement or manipulate the environment, right? These sort of conservation-based mechanisms to increase the beneficial insects that we get and sort of those services. And so in our lab, a lot of that work is coming from some of our survey work. So we're doing a lot of work trying to determine how landscape features, things like prairie potholes, which are common, really, say from Nebraska up into the prairie provinces where we are, which are these ephemeral wetlands. So they're sort of wetlands that are small, and they often are in the middle of your fields. But they tend to have, but because people don't seed around them, they often give sort of a variation in the plants. And so what we're doing a lot of, we're trying to think of things like those prairie potholes or the margins can lead to better biological control. So we're mostly interested in the insects, but then we have collaborators and some of the landscape ecologists that we know that are working on these questions too, are trying to think of how far do those effects spread, and are there some things you can do? So that's kind of the next step up, right? It's a little bit of a cultural control approach. And then in my lab, we are really interested in breeding. So we do a lot of work with the plant breeders. And in particular, because we have something called the Crop Development Center that's sort of embedded in our university. And so that's it's a center, but it's also faculty members who are breeders by avocation, and who are tasked with breeding crop varieties for Western Canada, and for the prairie provinces. And so that's a tiny bit of a unique thing because their varieties are also commercialized. And so Because of that, we have a bit of a direct line to them. So we do a lot of work trying to identify resistance to things like viral pathogens and insects, so we can find these resistant varieties, which I tend to think of as being sort of the golden ticket, right? The best version of pest management is to not have to manage the pests, and you do that by having varieties that are either tolerant or resistant to the pests you're worried about.
Perfect. Fantastic. I really enjoyed that you broke down your answer into these three categories. It's really interesting to understand that how long it takes to implement something and also its role within the overall cropping system.
Yeah, it takes 10 years to get a variety, depending on what it is, out. And so I think you can't rely on that as being your immediate solution, right? But it also takes less than 10 years for resistance to develop to insecticides. So you kind of need to be working both angles.
Absolutely. And, this is something that I was just thinking here as a curiosity of mine. So, we know that using any type of pesticide will eventually develop some type of resistance or tolerance in the target organism. How does that work when you're breeding genetically that resistance in the crop? Is it still perhaps promote some of that resistance on the target to happen eventually, or is it just a completely different mechanism that is safeguarded from that to some extent?
In the broader conceptual, it works the same way. So you do get we refer to it as resistance breaking down. The insects can overcome the resistance to whatever trait it is, and then the specifics depend on the trait. So we're talking about things like Bt, because that is still a toxin essentially. The resistance is very similar to what you might expect from any other insecticide. In the instances of some of the other traits, it really depends a bit on what the trait is that provides the resistance. Is it a chemical? Is it something physical like trichomes or wax? Is it tannins that the plant's producing? There are a lot of different ways you can sort of get to resistance to make the thing able to withstand the insect. Sometimes it's as simple as the behavior and the insect changes, and so instead of eating the leaves, they eat the stems, and they're a problem again. But it does break down, and one of the things we worry about with that is the breakdown. So I mentioned there's resistance to orange blossom wheat midge in wheat. And so we and our collaborators at Agriculture Canada have been, for instance, looking for alternative traits that can be incorporated in, because there's a single gene that gives you a single trait, basically. And so we do worry that eventually it'll stop working. And once that happens, you have no more resistance to the wheat midge. And it happens a lot. I could also say it happens a lot in Hessian fly. So Hessian fly is kind of famous for having resistance in wheat. Wheat growers all know this. But there are lots of ecotypes of Hessian fly, and there are lots of genes for resistance. And there's a lot of effort that you have to match them, because if you don't have a match, you won't actually have resistance that works.
Nice. Thanks for sharing that. All right. So along those lines, I do want us to talk a little bit more about bees. Perhaps could you educate me and the audience overall just about the impact that insecticide use and managing pests through that route can have on beneficial insects overall, but specifically on bees? And what are those implications? How can we perhaps try to avoid some of those negative aspects?
Right. The textbook answer, the thing I would tell your undergraduate class in applied entomology, is that insecticides are materials, they're chemicals that were designed to kill things, and mostly they're designed to kill insects. And some insecticides are very specific, but a lot of them, the majority of them, are not. And so if it kills insects, it is just as likely, or it is certainly just as probable, that it will kill some insects that you do want, which would be the beneficial insects that are either natural enemies of your pests or pollinators, or things like carabid beetles that eat weed seeds, right? So all of these things that we like, as they are to have an effect on the things that we don't want, which is the pest that we're spraying to target. And obviously a lot of the theory about insecticides, a lot of the different materials we make, a lot of the sort of systemic insecticides are intended to try to better manage that. They're trying to get around those concerns. But the fact remains that if you spray an insecticide across a field, it is likely to have an effect on any of the insects or most of the insects that would be in that field. And that includes the bees. And so if you are growing especially pollinated or flowering crops that the bees are visiting, then there's a high probability that you will contact the bees when you spray them. And obviously you're not supposed to spray most insecticides when plants are flowering, but that's not always the case. And it's not always a concern that has been put onto the sort of the labels and the instructions for all insecticides, because some things flower, but they're not necessarily pollinated, right? So they may be visited by a bee, but they don't need the bee to pollinate it, in which case that's not always as much of a concern or a thought as, say, horticultural crops that without a bee don't flower and produce fruit and give you no yield.
Awesome. And so I guess one of the ways perhaps to avoid having this negative effect on beneficial insects would just be, in this specific case of bees, would be to apply the correct insecticide at a time when bees are not around.
Timing is crucial. And then to a lesser extent, the choice of insecticide that you use, which not always do you have one, but some things are known to be more or less detrimental to bees. Right, the residual, so how long it's around will make a difference. And then this is the presumed benefit of systemic insecticides, is that especially if it's applied to something that's not flowering, so or that the bees are less likely to be visiting, you hopefully won't influence the bees because they're not eating the plant.
Fantastic. And so I myself am not in the entomology area, and I would believe many of our listeners may not be as well. So could you perhaps educate us around that topic in relation to what is the status currently of decline of bee numbers and beehives related to pesticide use, and perhaps your thoughts around that, of things that we can, as a society, as people that work with growers or maybe are growers ourselves, can do to alleviate that?
That's a hard question. The simple answer is that honeybees, at least the way we think of them, are livestock. So we tend, even though those people who are rearing honeybees tend to worry a lot, and those people who need them as a sort of a hired service worry a lot, honeybee numbers, at least for my purposes, as we interpret it, are not the most reliable number to worry about, because again, it would be like it's livestock. So it would be no different if you were worried about, say, your cattle numbers going up and down because you can sort of make more, right? It's a bit of an artificial number. What we do worry about are the native pollinators. That is the things that live in the ground and in tree holes and things like that are around all the time. And they are often the more effective pollinators for lots of stuff. They are often more abundant, and in instances where you're not bringing in your own pollinators, they are the ones that are doing the job. And there's no question, I think, at this point among anyone that thinks about these things, that they are in a vast decline. Pesticides are almost certainly part of that, but I don't think that if you ask most people, they will tell you they're the only reason. I'm not even sure we can necessarily say what is the key reason. I think it's clearly a combination of lots of factors. And so pesticides certainly contribute to that, but maybe not as much as things like large monocropping and climate change and sort of other agronomic practices, all of which can help things, but all of which can also contribute to the decline.
Perfect. Well, thanks for explaining that very clearly. I do plan to have my spring garden, having some wildflowers planted around the house. See if I can do my part to help out with that.
It's interesting because we grow different crops up here, and so canola is pollinated. Not hybrid canola; it's a little tricky, but a lot of canola does require pollination, at least to increase the yields. So do the fava beans that we grow here. And then it's a bit unusual. We grow alfalfa, which is not unusual on its own, but we actually grow alfalfa for seed. So often if you're getting seed to plant alfalfa for, say, forage or something, it's coming from our growers, who are some of our northernmost growers. And they need pollination because alfalfa doesn't flower without pollination. So they actually have to manage a different species of bees, the alfalfa leaf-cutting bee, specifically to make sure they get pollination. And that's kind of interesting because it presents a different problem. So they have to manage their insect pests in a way where they're particularly careful about not damaging the pollinators that are going to make sure that they have seed set and get the seed that they need to sell. And they pay for their bees. So they often rear their bees, and those are very expensive. And so it's sort of the extreme version of what we're talking about is a scenario like that where the bees matter to you for a lot of economic reasons in addition to sort of just wanting them. But it complicates your management decisions.
Absolutely. That's nice. Well, thanks for sharing that. So, I do want to expand on the canola and bee overlapping area here. So can you tell us a little? So when I read this, I was really interested and intrigued by it, by the fact that abiotic and biotic stresses in canola can affect the bees that pollinate it. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So this is work that was primarily done by a graduate student. Well, I guess he's now just about to be done or is done. Graduate student in my lab, Caleb Bryan. And so Caleb is really interested in bees, but he's also really interested in some of these questions about why populations are declining and why bee health is decreasing. And one of the things he's particularly interested in is how abiotic stress influences these interactions. Because if you think about an insect or you think about a bee, they need food, and their food source is the pollen and the nectar that plants produce. And that would apply across to any plant. But in a place like Saskatchewan, we grow tens of millions of seeded acres of canola. So it's the biggest resource that many of these bees have is the flowering canola. And it flowers for a very long time. So most of the season, that is what's available to them, even if some of the other things, the wildflowers, the weeds, those things are sort of more ephemeral. The thing about canola is that it's grown, at least where we are, it's dry land farming. So we don't irrigate anything, which means they're highly subjected to the precipitation. In fact, most of the water that a lot of what we're growing on does is actually snowpack. So you sort of have a lot of water early on, and then, depending on if you get rain or not or how much rain you have different levels of rain. And so what Caleb was really interested in, and part of this is from observation, because we had actually seen this in a couple of years where we had dry and wet years and some of our insect scurvys and things. We thought maybe there was making a difference. And what this led to is a bunch of experiments where he sort of controlled for lots of factors, but one of those is drought. So he basically can control for drought in artificial ways in sort of very, very large sort of artificial canola growing environments. And in those, he can do two things. He can look at the choices the bees make. So do they prefer one kind of plant or patch of plants or another? And then also, how do the bees themselves as a colony survive? And he does this with bumblebees for a bunch of reasons, including the fact that they're particularly important as pollinators of canola. And then we can also manipulate them a little bit. And what he finds is that when you drought stress the plants, they can tell. So the bees will preferentially forage on the sort of healthier plants, the plants that have not been subject to drought, versus the ones that do have drought. And then if you pair that with these sort of colony experiments, what you find is that their effects on the colony itself, so the bees and the number of bees and some of these sorts of things, are influenced by whether or not they were given well-watered canola or drought-stressed canola. And if you then take this to the sort of the level of the plant, what you find is that there are fewer flowers on the drought-stressed plants, and then there's also less nectar on the drought-stressed plants. And the nectar levels in canola are typically associated with the amount of sugar, so there's less sugar. So basically, when you're under drought stress, these plants make fewer flowers, and those flowers have less nectar, and that nectar is less healthy, and that has a direct effect on the bees. And interestingly, he took this even farther, and he actually used our historic collections and looked at the years for which we knew we were under drought, but say average temperature. So he did a lot of analysis of weather to find that. And what he found is that and this is sort of where some of our precision ag comes in, if you use your GIS and you sort of pick sections of these fields where you know that they are restricted to the field. So that is, they don't have any other resources except the canola, and you know that the canola was under stress or not stress in these different years, right? And you then take those bees and you measure them. There are effects of like size difference. So there are different numbers of bees. There's a change in the species, and some of the bees are bigger or smaller. And so we can take all that, and it can tell us that when you're under drought, it's going to affect your pollination in a lot of ways. So it affects the bees, but because the bees are the pollinators, it's going to affect the pollination, which will then affect your seed set and then affect your yield. And they did this in canola, but we expect that some of these patterns will follow across to other things. So we're now actually, there's another student in my lab who's now sort of taking this to a different, and he's using clover. So red clover is obligately outcrossed. So you have to pollinate it, right? And we actually also produce red clover for seed, so just like alfalfa. And he's actually done this, taking this even further. So he's looking at not only drought, but soil quality, right? And clover is a legume, so it's nitrogen fixing. So then we can actually take this even farther and ask, well, how does the interaction between the water, but then also the soil nitrogen, translate to things that the bees can tell? And it's still in progress, but there's reasons to believe that will make a difference. And then this takes us back to some of our agronomic practices, right? So can you offset these things by adding a little nitrogen, or would you not want to? Or or maybe can soil quality help compensate perhaps for some of these drought effects? So you can take these some pretty important patterns that, ideally maybe we'll be able to better manage the sort of the plants, both for the pollination and for the health of the bees.
This is fantastic. And I mean, once you say it, it makes perfect intuitive sense. But until you say you need to say it, like you're like not aware of it. So it's really interesting. And, especially this connection here between managing for the crop while perhaps indirectly also managing for the bees, and that interplay between bees, crops, pollination, seed set, and yield and profitability, right?
Yeah.
Really cool.
I think we have a lot of words nowadays for that. We like to throw things around like regenerative agriculture and things like that. But ultimately, what I actually suspect is, in many ways, it's just about getting a better understanding of some of these complexities, in figuring out how we can apply some of the tools that we now have to sort of use them, which maybe people were doing all along. Sometimes I wonder if all we're not doing is making really fancy ways of doing what my grandfather would have done 150 years ago or something.
Nice, yeah, absolutely. Some new terms that describe things that have been done already, right?
Right, yeah. I think there's a lot of places where you ask someone, you're like, well, I always had bees because we wanted honey, and you're like, oh, yeah, okay.
Now that I was kind of like thinking through, I guess, our entire conversation here, and really, like in my head, tying this knot of, there are ways that we manage the crop for the crop itself that may be detrimental to beneficial insects, like insecticide use, right? But perhaps there are other ways that we may manage our crop, like irrigating or fertilizing appropriately, that are beneficial for the crop, yes, but also beneficial to the bees. So it's like all these complex interactions between environment, crop, insects, and everything else that we know interacts in that setting.
Yeah, exactly. It's ecology. We sometimes don't want to call it that, or sometimes we forget it is, but it is. And I don't know. I think sometimes I come back to not flippantly, but sort of like I sort of just applied the art of being a farmer. To put it, sometimes the knowledge that sometimes the old timers, so to speak, have, and they just like kind of and we attribute it to feel. I think sometimes that's because, especially if you've been in the place for a long time, you kind of, the feel is actually because you kind of have the intuitive thing because you've seen it before, or you like remember what's happened. We have a lot of indigenous reserves and a lot of little connections to the indigenous sort of agriculture community at our university, and to some extent my lab too. And I think that's another thing you get something from them, is that when you've been growing in the same place for hundreds, thousands of years, sometimes you know a little bit about things, and it's like, well, they've been growing, setting fire to the grasslands, and it turns out that that's really helpful for a lot of reasons. And then you kind of forget that, and then you go back and you're like, "Oh, we should burn the grasslands." And you're just like, "Well, yeah, they've known that for like 1,000 years."
Absolutely, different ways of knowing and learning, right? Like there is the scientific method, but there is also native knowledge or indigenous knowledge and other ways as well, right?
Yeah. Sometimes I think that what we do is we find out what the mechanism behind the observations that have already been made.
Absolutely. Fantastic.
It's time for our famous three. Explore the future of agriculture with KWS, a global leader in innovation and sustainable farming practices. Uncover the exceptional qualities of our hybrid rye, cultivating a legacy for a greener tomorrow. Visit kws.com/US for more information and for dealer locations. KWS, seeding the future since 1856.
Well, if you're listening to this episode, I ask that you drop us a like, follow us if you're not following yet, and make sure to share this great conversation with anyone you think may benefit from it as well. And so now we're shifting towards the end of our episode with the 3 questions that we ask every guest. So Sean, the first one I want to ask you is, do you have any ag-related resources that you've come across and found very useful that you could share with us?
I absolutely can. So I am particularly fond of it's a document. It can be downloaded as a PDF, but it's also a book. And it comes out of Agriculture Canada. It's called Field Crop and Forage Pests and Their Natural Enemies in Western Canada. And so it's a guide for identification and management, and it has pictures, and it's, I think, arranged by crop, but also by insect group. And it's a really good resource, not just for Western Canada, but sort of the bordering areas, North Dakota, anywhere where you kind of have the same cropping systems and kind of geographic areas. And it's a really good book. And it's something that we tend to recommend to sort of all of our growers and all of our friends, just kind of keep in the truck, because when you see things, it's often a really, really, really useful way of kind of figuring out what you've got. So.
Awesome. Can you tell me the name one more time?
Sure. It's called Field Crop and Forage Pests and Their Natural Enemies in Western Canada.
And is that something that can be downloaded free of cost, or do you have to purchase it?
Yep. It is a free document. You can download it as a PDF directly from Agriculture Canada.
Awesome. Sounds great. Well, that's definitely a very, very important resource. As you said, especially if you are within areas that share a similar cropping system. Thanks for sharing that. All right, so our next question here is the same, but instead of a ag-related resource, is a non-ag-related resource. Would you have any of those to recommend to us?
Resource, no. The thing that I really like, that I encourage people to read, sure. So it's a book, because these are books, and it's called Predator on a Flower, and it's a book written by one of my mentors, and it is just a really interesting book about entomology and about spiders and about sort of the ecology of ecosystems. And it's some of these kinds of questions that we think about. Why do certain insects eat other insects, and why do they move between flowers and things, are really sort of gotten at in that. And it's kind of a really fun book, I think. And it is something I make my students read. So
nice. And you said Predator on a Flower?
Yeah, it's called Predator Upon a Flower. It's written by a guy named Douglas Morse.
I'm taking note of that as well here to add to my reading list.
It's a good book.
All right. Our last question of the day is, in your opinion, based on your experience, what type of skill set do you think professional or successful professionals have?
You know, it's funny, I guess, but I mean, I don't think so. Even if I think I have an answer, I don't. Curiosity. I mean, curiosity helps a lot.
Yeah, that is definitely something. One of the skills that come up a lot when we ask this question. Yeah, curiosity is definitely important.
I find that it doesn't matter what role I'm playing. It doesn't matter if I'm being a researcher or teaching a class or sort of going out at kind of an extension mission, right? Going out to try to put boots on the ground. It comes up. And it even comes up, I would say, with some of the best farming operations, right? Often the best growers we talk to when we want to do things on farm, when we want to get things, when we want to know what's going on in the real world, it's always the ones who are curious and ask questions, right? They just seem to have a bit, why does this happen? Usually the answer is, I don't know, but
Nice, absolutely.
But I think that goes a long way because it leads to generating knowledge. It leads to thinking about different ways you can do stuff. It's important.
Absolutely. I totally agree. All right. Well, I think with that, we wrap up today's episode. I want to, Sean, thank you for your time being here with us. I really learned a lot about insects and cropping systems and how they relate to each other. That was very, very, very beneficial, pun intended. And I'm sure that other all of our member of our audience also is gonna relate to that. So thanks for your time, and really appreciate having you here today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. It was fun.